Right now, there is a clock counting down that almost nobody knows exists. Scientists call it the crash clock, and as of last year it hit 2.8 days. 2.8. That's how long our entire orbital system, every GPS signal, every weather satellite, every piece of technology keeping modern civilization running, could survive if the satellites suddenly stopped dodging each other. Not months, not weeks, days. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. The sun is doing something right now that could force exactly that scenario. Stick with me, because what's building above your head right now is something nobody in mainstream media is talking about. Yet. If this already has you asking questions, hit like and subscribe to the Sky Lab, because this story is not finished. The crash clock is still falling. The solar regions are still rotating into position, and the gap between what officials are saying and what the data is showing, somebody needs to keep filling that in. That is what we do here. You want to be here when the next piece breaks. Now, let us get into it. Part 1. The 2.8-day problem. There is a number that most people have never heard of, and the scientists who study it are hoping you never need to. It is not a temperature reading. It is not a radiation level. It is not a seismic index or an atmospheric pressure figure or any of the measurements we typically reach for when we want to understand how stable the world around us is. It is a time measurement, and what it measures is this. If every satellite in low Earth orbit suddenly lost the ability to maneuver, if the thrusters went quiet, if the computers stopped calculating, if the entire choreography of avoidance that keeps our orbital environment from eating itself came to a halt, how long would it take before the first catastrophic collision occurred? Not the first close call, the first actual catastrophic collision. The kind that does not just destroy 2 satellites, but sprays enough debris into the orbital environment to threaten dozens more. In 2018, that number was 121 days. That is nearly 4 months of margin. 4 months during which the system could theoretically lose its mind, and engineers on the ground would still have time to notice, respond, coordinate, and begin recovery. 121 days felt uncomfortable, but it felt manageable. It felt like a problem you could work on. By June of 2025, that number had collapsed to 2.8 days. 2.8 days, 67 hours, not 4 months, not 4 weeks, not even 4 days. 2.8. That is the figure that emerged from a preprint released in December of 2025 by researchers Thiele, Hyland, Bowley and Lawler, a team who had spent considerable time staring at the current state of low Earth orbit and apparently did not particularly enjoy what they found. The metric they were calculating is called the Collision Risk Assessment for Space Habitats, or CRASH, and it is designed to answer a single brutal question. How fragile is this system, right now, today, if something goes wrong? And the answer, as of the most recent estimate, is more fragile than anyone publicly said out loud until very recently. Now, before you internalize that number, it is worth being precise about what it actually means, because precision matters here, and the temptation to either overstate or understate the situation is real. The crash metric is calculated under a specific assumption: complete loss of collision avoidance maneuvering across the entire satellite population. Every satellite simultaneously stops dodging. That is the baseline scenario the model uses. It is an extreme assumption, which is exactly why the result is so disturbing. Because even under that extreme assumption, the margin is 2.8 days. There is actually a second estimate in the same research, closer to 5.5 days, which uses a slightly different set of parameters. Both estimates are in the paper. The researchers themselves are clear that the range reflects genuine uncertainty in the modelling inputs, orbital density estimates, conjunction frequency data, the precise distribution of trackable versus untrackable debris. But here is the thing about that range. 5.5 days is not reassuring. If your house has a gas leak, and one engineer tells you it will explode in 2.8 hours, and another tells you 5.5 hours, the correct response is not to feel better about the second estimate. What the statistical translation looks like is worth sitting with for a moment. If maneuvering was lost for 24 hours, the probability of a catastrophic collision somewhere in the orbital environment rises to approximately 30%. Lose it for 48 hours, and that rises to around 50%. By 72 hours, 3 days, you're looking at roughly 65%. Those are not small numbers. Those are coin flip numbers applied to scenarios that would fundamentally alter the infrastructure of modern civilization. The researchers who put this paper out are not science fiction writers. They are not alarmists by reputation. They use the phrase "within days" in their abstract, which is the kind of language that, in the measured world of academic space research, is roughly equivalent to a fire alarm. When orbital mechanics researchers start writing like thriller novelists, the appropriate response is to pay attention. Here is what makes this psychologically different from every previous warning about orbital congestion. For years, for decades, actually, the story about space debris was framed as a future problem, a coming crisis, a scenario we needed to prevent. The language was almost always predictive. We were told that at some point, if we kept launching satellites without cleaning up after ourselves, we would reach a threshold after which the debris environment would become self-sustaining, and no new satellites could be safely operated in certain orbital bands. This is the scenario Donald Kessler described in 1978, and it became known as Kessler syndrome, and it was treated for a very long time as a cautionary tale about the future. The shift that the crash metric forces is this: the system now survives on uptime, not on safety margins, not on buffer time, not on inherent stability, on continuous, active, uninterrupted management. The orbital environment is not stable in the way a chair is stable, where you can walk away and come back, and it is still a chair. It is stable in the way a bicycle is stable when you're actively riding it. The moment you stop pedaling, stop steering, stop compensating, the bicycle falls over. The question that 2.8 days raises, and that this video intends to follow wherever it leads, is: what happens when something forces the rider to let go of the handlebars? And as it turns out, something is coming that has done exactly that before. Part 2. Why this number is so disturbing. The assumption embedded in the crash metric, complete loss of collision avoidance capability, sounds like the kind of extreme scenario you model precisely because it is unlikely. A worst-case thought experiment, a theoretical flaw. Except that when you begin to pull apart what collision avoidance capability actually requires in practice, the assumption starts to look a great deal less extreme than it first appears. Think about what needs to be functioning correctly and simultaneously for a satellite to successfully execute a collision avoidance maneuver. First, you need accurate tracking data. You need to know where the threatening object is, where it is going, and what the conjunction geometry looks like hours or days in advance. That data comes primarily from the United States Space Surveillance Network and from commercial tracking services, which aggregate radar and optical observations from ground stations distributed around the planet. The accuracy of those predictions degrades over time, which is why close approach warnings are typically issued 72 hours out, but are not acted upon until within about 48 hours, when the probability estimates have stabilized enough to justify the fuel cost of a maneuver. If the tracking data is wrong, if something is interfering with the sensors or distorting the atmospheric drag models that the tracking algorithms depend on, the collision prediction is wrong. And if the prediction is wrong, the maneuver is either missed or executed in the wrong direction. Second, you need a functioning uplink between the ground and the satellite. The satellite has to receive the maneuver command, confirm it, and execute it within a narrow window. If the communications link is disrupted, if radio frequency interference is elevated, if signal blackouts are occurring, if the ground station network is experiencing reduced coverage, the command does not get through in time. The satellite keeps its current trajectory. The close approach becomes a collision. Third, and this is the part that often gets overlooked, you need the satellite itself to be functioning. Its propulsion system needs to be operational. Its attitude control needs to be stable. Its onboard computer needs to be executing commands correctly, rather than experiencing soft errors from radiation exposure. Modern satellites are remarkably resilient, but they are not invulnerable. Now hold those three requirements in your mind for a moment. Accurate tracking, intact communications, functioning hardware, and ask yourself, what kind of event could simultaneously degrade all three across thousands of satellites at the same time? The answer, which we are going to spend considerable time on, is a geomagnetic storm of sufficient intensity and duration. But before we get there is something important to understand about how this kind of failure propagates. It does not need to be total. That is the part that makes the crash metric so unsettling, even under real-world conditions rather than its theoretical worst case. This is the concept of coupled system failure, and it is worth understanding because it is how most large complex systems actually break. Power grids do not fail because every transformer simultaneously explodes. They fail because one element becomes stressed, which shifts load to adjacent elements, which become stressed, which causes a cascading redistribution of demand across a network that was not designed to handle that redistribution, until something trips and a significant portion of the system goes dark. Financial markets do not crash because every trader simultaneously decides to sell. They crash because a triggering event creates a feedback loop of automated responses, each individually rational, collectively destabilizing, that drives prices through levels that trigger more automated responses. The orbital environment now has this same architecture. We have thousands of satellites, each making avoidance maneuvers based on the same pool of tracking data, each communicating through the same frequency bands, each affected by the same thermospheric density variations when solar activity changes. When you stress one part of that system, say you degrade GPS positioning accuracy during a geomagnetic storm, which makes conjunction predictions less reliable, you do not just affect a few satellites, you affect every satellite that depends on GPS-augmented orbit determination, which is most of them. And when those satellites start making maneuvers based on slightly corrupted positioning data, each of those maneuvers introduces a new uncertainty into the tracking picture for every other satellite in the vicinity. The errors compound, the conjunction warning list grows, the maneuver frequency increases, the system workload spikes precisely when its underlying data quality has declined. This is what we mean when we say the system has synchronized fragility. It is not that every satellite fails at once, it is that the conditions that degrade performance for one satellite tend to degrade performance for all of them simultaneously, and they are all trying to respond in the same coordination environment that is itself being degraded. We already have an empirical demonstration of this. In February of 2022, SpaceX attempted to deploy a batch of 49 Starlink satellites during what was classified as a minor geomagnetic storm, a G1 event. On the 1 to 5 scale of geomagnetic disturbance, a G1 is the bottom rung. It is the kind of event that happens dozens of times per year. It is not supposed to be operationally significant. 38 of those 49 satellites were destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. The geomagnetic storm had heated the thermosphere enough to increase atmospheric drag at the deployment altitude, and the satellites could not raise their orbits fast enough to escape the denser air. They deorbited within days. One minor storm, 38 satellites, in a single afternoon. That event is worth keeping in the background of every conversation about orbital stability because it tells us something specific and important. We do not need total system failure to produce catastrophic outcomes. We need enough degradation across enough satellites at the same time, and the threshold for that is apparently lower than most people assumed. The February 2022 loss happened before the orbital environment reached its current density. The crash metric was worse then than it was in 2018, but it was not yet at 2.8 days. We are operating in a significantly more congested environment today than we were when 38 satellites were lost to a G1 storm, which means the question is not whether the system can be disrupted. The question is what the disruption looks like now that the environment it is disrupting is already operating inside the fragility window. And that question is about to become relevant in a way that the timing of this video is not entirely coincidental. Part 3. The hidden acceleration nobody modelled correctly. Here is something that the people who designed the regulatory frameworks governing commercial satellite deployment in the early 2010s did not predict, and probably could not have predicted, because the scale of what actually happened was genuinely unprecedented. The International Academy of Astronautics and NASA's Orbital Debris Program Office, along with a consortium of international space agencies known as the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, spent years developing models for how the orbital environment would evolve over time. These models were serious, rigorous, computationally intensive exercises in population dynamics, tracking debris objects, modelling collision probabilities, simulating fragmentation events, projecting how the environment would change decade by decade under various deployment scenarios. They were not careless, they were the state of the art, and almost every one of those models placed the critical threshold crossing, the point at which the orbital environment in key altitude bands would become self-sustaining without active management, somewhere in the 2030s, possibly the 2040s, under moderate growth assumptions. The models had a high growth scenario too. But even those high-growth projections did not anticipate what actually happened. What actually happened was the mega constellation. Before 2019, the global active satellite population was somewhere around 2,000 objects, a number that had grown slowly over 60 years of spaceflight. Then SpaceX began deploying Starlink in earnest, and within roughly 6 years, the active satellite population tripled, then grew further. By 2026, there are somewhere north of 10,000 active satellites in orbit, the majority of them in low Earth orbit at altitudes between 300 and 600 kilometers, which is precisely the altitude band that the debris models identified as the most sensitive to density increases. The modelling failure was not a calculation error, it was an assumption error. The models assumed gradual, linear, roughly predictable growth in satellite deployment. What they got was exponential scaling driven by a single commercial operator with access to reusable rockets, vertical integration across manufacturing and launch, and an economic incentive structure that rewarded deploying satellites as fast as physically possible. The gap between the model's high-growth scenario and reality was not a factor of 2. In some altitude bands, it was more than an order of magnitude, compressed into half the expected time frame. This is sometimes described as a policy lag problem, and that framing is accurate but slightly too gentle. The Federal Communications Commission's 5-year deorbit rule, which requires satellite operators to deorbit their spacecraft within 5 years of end of mission, was designed to limit long-term debris accumulation. It was a reasonable rule written for a world where a few hundred satellites were being launched per year. We are now launching thousands per year. The deorbit rule has not changed. The consequence is that at any given moment, the population of satellites committed to occupying a given altitude band is growing faster than the 5-year disposal window can drain it. And the active removal side of the equation is, to use a clinical term, essentially zero. The first dedicated active debris removal mission, ClearSpace 1, is targeted for 2029 and is designed to capture a single object, a rocket adapter stage that has been in orbit since 2013. One object, in 2029, against a backdrop of 1.2 million trackable objects above 1 centimetre and hundreds of millions of smaller fragments. The removal rate is not keeping pace with the generation rate. It is not even in the same conversation. What we accelerated into between 2019 and today was a regime that the models did not project arriving until the 2030s. We got there in roughly 6 years, and here is the part that matters for the central question of this video. We accelerated into that regime faster than we could develop the tools, the regulations, and the coordination frameworks to manage it. The system we are operating today is not the system any of the models described. It is a system that emerged from a deployment rate that outran the modelling, the policy, and the infrastructure designed to govern it. Which brings us to where things actually stand right now, in the spring of 2026, and the numbers are worth going through carefully because they are more striking than most people realise. Part 4. The system is already saturated. The raw numbers of the current orbital environment are staggering, but they tend to wash over people because large numbers are hard to process intuitively. So let us try to make them concrete. There are currently more than 50,000 trackable objects in Earth orbit. Trackable means large enough to be detected and catalogued by the Space Surveillance Network, roughly 10 centimeters or larger. But the tracking threshold does not represent a physical boundary for danger. A 1 centimeter fragment travelling at orbital velocity, somewhere between 7 and 8 kilometers per second relative to an operational satellite, carries enough kinetic energy to destroy a spacecraft. There are an estimated 1.2 million objects above 1 centimeter currently in orbit that are too small to be tracked. Below 1 centimeter, the fragment population rises into the hundreds of millions. Now, one of the immediate objections to this picture is that orbital space is enormous. Surely, with all that volume, the probability of any specific pair of objects being in the same place at the same time remains low, and at the level of individual object pairs, that is technically correct. But you are not dealing with individual object pairs. You are dealing with a population of tens of thousands of trackable objects and millions of untrackable ones, all sharing the same orbital shell with the conjunction frequency scaling not linearly, but roughly with the square of the population density. As the population doubles, the conjunction rate does not double, it quadruples. The current global conjunction rate, meaning the frequency at which two objects approach within a dangerous threshold of each other, is approximately one event every 22 seconds. Let that settle for a moment. Every 22 seconds, somewhere in low Earth orbit, two objects come close enough that if either one were in a slightly different position, a collision would occur. That is not a once-a-day event. It is a continuous, relentless drumbeat of near misses that the system is constantly responding to. Within the densest constellation zones, the rate is significantly higher. Starlink satellites alone are executing approximately 800 collision avoidance maneuvers per day. 800 per day. Across the entire active satellite population, the annual maneuver count is estimated to exceed 100,000. To put that in operational terms, there is no longer such a thing as a satellite that is passively maintaining its orbit without ongoing collision management. Collision avoidance is not an exception. It is the continuous background condition of existence in low Earth orbit. This matters for the stability picture in a way that is not immediately obvious. Each maneuver is not a clean, consequence-free event. When a satellite fires its thrusters to avoid a conjunction, it changes its orbit. That changed orbit then alters the conjunction geometry for every other object in the vicinity. The tracking system has to be updated. New conjunction predictions have to be run. In some cases, those new predictions generate new warnings, which require additional maneuvers, which generate further updates. The system feeds back on itself. What this means is that the orbital environment is no longer in a state that can be meaningfully described as passive. It is not a collection of objects moving in predictable Keplerian trajectories that ground-based operators monitor occasionally and adjust when necessary. It is a dynamic, coupled system in which thousands of actors are making constant interventions, each intervention introducing new uncertainties, and the aggregate stability of the system depending on all of those interventions being executed correctly, simultaneously, based on a shared pool of tracking data that is always slightly imperfect. The analogy that captures this best is air traffic control, but air traffic control pushed past the point of healthy operation into a regime where the controllers are managing not hundreds of aircraft, but tens of thousands, with no clear separation between tracks, with radar data that has known gaps, and where the consequence of a single coordination failure is not a delayed flight, but a wreckage event that generates new hazards for every other flight currently airborne. Think about what it means for a system to be described that way, and then ask what happens when that system is simultaneously stressed from the outside. What happens when the tracking data gets noisier? What happens when the communications links degrade? What happens when thermospheric drag becomes unpredictable, and the orbit predictions that underpin all of those conjunction warnings are suddenly less reliable than the algorithms assume? We do not need to speculate about this because we have already seen it happen, and the next time it happens, the environment it happens in is considerably more saturated than it was the last time. Part 5. The uncomfortable reframe. Everything covered so far can be packaged as a risk assessment, a description of elevated danger, of tightening margins, of a system that is more fragile than it used to be. That framing is accurate, but it may be insufficiently precise, because there is a more exact way to describe the current state of low Earth orbit, and it changes the nature of the conversation. The orbital environment in the altitude bands between 400 and 1,000 kilometers is no longer a risk environment. It is a managed instability. Those are different things, and the difference matters enormously. A risk environment is one where danger exists but the underlying system is stable. You are operating within acceptable parameters, and adverse events are possible, but not structurally inevitable. The danger is real, but the ground is firm. A managed instability is something different. It is a system that has already crossed into a regime where, without continuous active intervention, it will move toward a worse state. The stability is not inherent, it is imposed. Remove the management and you do not get a riskier, stable environment. You get a system that begins moving, on its own dynamics, toward collapse. The nuclear reactor analogy is the clearest way to illustrate this. A subcritical nuclear reactor can be left alone. It is inherently stable. You can walk away and come back and it is still subcritical. A reactor operating at criticality, the threshold at which the chain reaction is self-sustaining, cannot be walked away from. It requires active control systems that continuously absorb neutrons to prevent the reaction from accelerating. Remove those control systems and the reactor does not stay at criticality. It goes toward runaway. The stability exists only as long as the management does. Research published by Kessler and Courpalais updated in subsequent decades and most recently captured in the work being discussed in this video, identifies two critical thresholds for the orbital environment. The first is what we might call the unstable threshold, the point at which the collision-generated debris production rate exceeds the natural decay rate, meaning debris is accumulating faster than atmospheric drag is removing it. The second is the runaway threshold, the point at which debris production from existing collisions and fragmentations is sufficient to generate further collisions through its own density, independent of any new launches. Above the runaway threshold, the cascade becomes self-sustaining. You do not need to add anything to the environment for it to get worse. It gets worse on its own. Based on the most recent analysis, the unstable threshold has been crossed at altitudes between 400 and 1,000 kilometers. The runaway threshold has been crossed at altitudes between 520 and 1,000 kilometers. The mega constellations operate at approximately 550 kilometers. You can do the arithmetic yourself. Now, here is the critical clarification that prevents this from being misread as hysteria. Crossing the runaway threshold does not mean a cascade is happening right now. It does not mean satellites are being destroyed today by self-sustaining debris production. What it means is that the potential for self-sustaining growth exists. The conditions necessary for a runaway cascade are present. Whether that potential is actualized depends on what triggers it, whether a sufficiently large fragmentation event occurs, whether a sufficiently sustained disruption degrades the collision avoidance network, whether the system is hit by a stress event large enough to push it across the next threshold. This is the most important reframe in the entire video, and it is worth stating plainly. We are not on the outside of a potential cascade looking at it from a distance. We are operating inside the early phase conditions of one. The environment has crossed into a regime where cascade is structurally possible. What is preventing it is the management layer, the continuous, coordinated, uninterrupted operation of collision avoidance across thousands of satellites simultaneously. Which means the question that has been building since the opening of this video, what happens when that management layer is interrupted, is not a hypothetical about a distant future scenario. It is a question about what could happen in the next days, weeks, or months in an environment that is already configured for cascade, being maintained in a non-cascade state purely through active management. And the Sun, as it happens, is about to have opinions about that. Part 6. The current solar stack. As of early May 2026, the solar activity forecast coming out of NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center reads like a weather bulletin that a sensible person would take seriously. Not a catastrophic bulletin, not a once-in-a-century event warning, but the kind of forecast that, if you understand the orbital context we have just spent 5 parts establishing, upgrades from routine monitoring to active concern. Here is what is currently in the pipeline. A coronal hole high-speed stream is arriving, delivering elevated solar wind speeds and an increase in geomagnetic activity at Earth's magnetosphere. Independently of that, 2 active regions on the solar surface are currently rotating into Earth-facing position, meaning they are moving from the limb of the Sun, where their eruptions would be directed away from Earth, toward the central disk, where an eruption would send material directly along the Sun-Earth line. The forecast probability of M-class flares, significant but not extreme, is elevated across the relevant window. The probability of an X-class flare, which is the most powerful category on the GOES classification scale, is running at approximately 10% for the May 8th and 9th window. Taken individually, none of those items is extraordinary. Coronal hole streams are regular features of the solar cycle. Active regions producing M and X-class flares are normal during solar maximum, which we are currently in or very close to. A 10% X-class probability is non-negligible, but not alarming by itself. Space weather forecasters would classify this as an elevated activity period, not a crisis. But the orbital context changes how you read that forecast, because the question is not whether any individual element of the solar stack is extreme. The question is whether the combination, a background geomagnetic disturbance from the coronal hole stream, arriving simultaneously with potentially significant flare activity from 2 active regions in favourable geometry, is sufficient to stress the collision avoidance network in an environment that we have just established is already operating inside the stability window on a margin of 2.8 days. The Sun does not need to be extreme to matter here, it just needs to be persistent. and the current forecast suggests a period of overlapping drivers that is unlike anything we have seen at this stage of the year. Multiple moderate sources of geomagnetic stress arriving in the same window, each individually manageable, together representing a compound load on infrastructure that is already running near capacity. The phrase that captures this is geomagnetic stacking. When a coronal hole stream and an active region eruption arrive at Earth simultaneously, their effects on the magnetosphere are not simply additive, they interact. The solar wind conditions that a coronal hole stream produces can precondition the magnetosphere in ways that make it more responsive to a subsequent coronal mass ejection. The result can be a geomagnetic storm significantly more intense than either driver would produce alone. We have already established that a minor G1 geomagnetic storm was sufficient to destroy 38 Starlink satellites in February of 2022. The current forecast involves drivers capable of producing G3 or G4 conditions if they arrive with unfavourable timing, and the environment they are arriving into is not the environment of 2022. It is an environment 3 years further into mega-constellation deployment, 3 years further past the threshold crossings identified in the Kessler analysis, and operating on a crash metric that has collapsed from whatever it was in 2022 to 2.8 days today. The solar stack is not the disaster, it is the test, and the system being tested is already under strain. Part 7. The Coronal Hole Anomaly. Coronal holes are regions on the Sun's surface where the magnetic field lines do not loop back in on themselves, but instead extend outward into interplanetary space, allowing the solar wind to escape along those open field lines at significantly higher velocities than the typical solar wind. The result is a high-speed stream, a river of fast-moving charged particles that sweeps past Earth as the Sun rotates, typically lasting a few days and producing mild to moderate geomagnetic disturbance. They are routine features of solar observation, and under normal circumstances would not merit special attention. The coronal hole currently being tracked is not behaving normally. The relevant anomaly is its persistence. A typical coronal hole of significant size will survive 2 to 4 of the Sun's 27-day rotation periods before it dissipates or reorganizes. This one has persisted across approximately 8 solar rotations. That is more than twice the typical maximum persistence, and it has not simply survived in a weakened form, it has actually grown over the course of its persistence, with the open field region expanding rather than contracting. This is not a common observational pattern, and it has attracted research interest precisely because its physical cause is not fully understood. From an operational standpoint, the persistence of a large coronal hole means something specific. Repeated thermospheric heating cycles. Each time Earth passes through the high-speed stream associated with this coronal hole, which happens approximately every 27 days as the Sun rotates, the magnetosphere is disturbed, auroral energy is deposited into the polar upper atmosphere, and the thermosphere, the atmospheric layer between roughly 90 and several hundred kilometers altitude where low Earth orbit satellites operate, expands outward as it absorbs that energy. The expansion increases the density of residual atmospheric molecules at satellite altitudes, which increases drag on those satellites, which changes their orbits. The word that matters there is changes. Not by large amounts. The orbital changes from a single moderate geomagnetic event are small, but they are changes that the tracking algorithms and conjunction prediction systems must account for. If those changes are incorrectly modelled, if the thermospheric density at a given altitude differs from what the atmospheric model predicts, then the orbital positions propagated forward in time will be wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough that conjunction warnings issued 72 hours in advance may be less reliable than the probability figures attached to them suggest. This is the subtle operational consequence of prolonged coronal hole activity that rarely gets discussed in general coverage. It is not that the coronal hole stream is powerful enough to damage satellites directly. It is that repeated thermospheric heating cycles introduce a systematic, accumulating uncertainty into the orbital tracking picture. Each heating event changes drag conditions. Each drag change modifies orbits. Each orbit modification requires an update to the conjunction database. And if the atmospheric models used to make those predictions are themselves uncertain about thermospheric density, because the density behavior is being driven by a coronal hole with unusual persistence and growth characteristics, then the updates may not fully capture the actual orbital state. That accumulating uncertainty feeds directly back into the collision avoidance problem. Remember that collision avoidance maneuvers are triggered by probability thresholds derived from conjunction analyses. If the conjunction analyses are systematically underestimating collision probability because the atmospheric model is underestimating thermospheric density, then maneuvers that should be executed are not being triggered, and close approaches that look safe on paper are in reality closer to the edge than the operators know. We are not yet in a regime where this is causing visible operational failures, but we are in a regime where the margin between the model and reality is tighter than it should be, and where a sustained period of anomalous coronal hole behaviour is making it tighter still. That margin connects directly back to the 2.8 days. Every source of additional uncertainty in the tracking picture effectively erodes that number further. Part 8. Failure. Pathways most people overlook. The way geomagnetic storms get described in general media tends to focus on their most dramatic effects. Power grid disruptions, radio blackouts, aurora at unusual latitudes. These are real effects and they are worth understanding, but they are not the failure pathways that matter most for orbital stability. The failure pathways that matter for the system we have been describing are subtler, more distributed, and in some respects more insidious, precisely because they do not announce themselves with obvious disruptions. The first pathway, which we have already introduced, is thermospheric expansion and its effect on drag modelling. This is not dramatic. It manifests as a gradual divergence between predicted and actual orbital positions across the satellite population. No individual satellite is obviously in trouble. The aggregate effect is a degradation of the tracking picture's accuracy, and therefore a degradation of the conjunction prediction quality that the entire collision avoidance system depends on. The second pathway is surface charging. When energetic particles from a geomagnetic storm interact with the outer surfaces of satellites, they deposit electrical charge. If that charge builds up faster than it can be dissipated, it creates electrostatic potential differences across the spacecraft surface. Those potential differences can discharge suddenly, arcing across insulation, damaging sensitive electronics, triggering anomalous resets in onboard computers. Surface charging events are a well-documented cause of satellite anomalies during geomagnetic storms. They are not always fatal, but an anomalous computer reset during a collision avoidance maneuver window is not a benign event. It is precisely the kind of failure that could cause a satellite to miss a critical maneuver. The third pathway is deep dielectric charging, which is distinct from surface charging and operates on a slower timescale. High-energy electrons from prolonged geomagnetic activity penetrate beyond a satellite's outer surface and become embedded in internal insulating materials. The charge accumulates over hours or days, then discharges suddenly and internally, where the damage is harder to detect and can manifest as delayed failures that occur well after the storm has passed. This is why some satellite anomalies cluster in the days following a geomagnetic event rather than during it. The charge was deposited during the storm and discharged afterward. The fourth pathway is GPS disruption. The global positioning system and its international equivalents depend on radio signal propagation through the ionosphere. During geomagnetic storms, the ionosphere becomes irregular and turbulent, causing GPS signals to scintillate, meaning they fluctuate in strength and are subject to phase errors. GPS augmented orbit determination, which most modern satellites use to maintain precise knowledge of their position, becomes less reliable. Conjunction predictions derived from GPS-based position data become less accurate, and less accurate conjunction predictions mean that some real close approaches will be assessed as safe, and some safe approaches will be assessed as close, generating unnecessary maneuvers that clutter the tracking picture while missing actual threats. The fifth pathway is radio frequency blackout, direct disruption of the command and control links between ground stations and satellites. During severe solar radio bursts, which can accompany X-class flare events, specific frequency bands used for satellite telemetry and command can be temporarily overwhelmed. The disruption is usually short-lived, minutes to tens of minutes rather than hours, but a ground station that cannot communicate with a satellite cannot issue a maneuver command. If the blackout window overlaps with a maneuver execution window, the maneuver is missed. Now, the key insight about all 5 of these pathways is that they are distributed. They do not take down one satellite. They degrade the performance of thousands of satellites simultaneously, each by a small amount across the same time window. No single failure is catastrophic, but the aggregate effect on the coordination network, on the shared pool of tracking data, on the reliability of conjunction predictions, on the ability of operators to command maneuvers with confidence, is what produces the systemic risk. This is what desynchronization means in the context of the orbital environment. Not that everything breaks, that the subtle, simultaneous, distributed degradation of the coordination infrastructure causes the system to lose coherence. Operators are working with position data that is slightly wrong. Maneuver windows are being missed for reasons that are individually explicable but collectively significant. The conjunction probability estimates that drive maneuver decisions are becoming less reliable in ways that are not immediately visible. The gap between the model and reality widens, and in an environment operating on a crash metric of 2.8 days, every increment of that gap matters. Part 9. The February 2022 Warning Shot. We mentioned the February 2022 Starlink loss earlier as an empirical precedent. It deserves its own examination because the details are more instructive than a passing reference captures. On February 3rd of 2022, SpaceX launched 49 Starlink satellites on a Falcon 9 rocket from the Kennedy Space Center. The deployment was to a low initial orbit, approximately 210 kilometers, from which the satellites were supposed to use their ion thrusters to gradually raise themselves to their operational altitude of approximately 550 kilometers. Deploying to a low initial orbit is standard Starlink practice. If a satellite fails to function correctly after deployment, the low initial orbit means it will naturally deorbit quickly from atmospheric drag rather than remaining as debris at operational altitude. It is a sensible debris mitigation strategy. What happened next was not part of the plan. A geomagnetic storm hit Earth on February 3rd and 4th. The storm was classified as a G1, the weakest category on the 5-level NOAA scale. G1 events occur roughly 17 times per year on average during solar minimum, more frequently during solar maximum. They are not considered operationally significant under normal circumstances. But this particular G1 storm arrived during an unusual period of elevated solar activity, and its effect on the thermosphere at 210 kilometers altitude was more pronounced than the atmospheric models predicted. Thermospheric density at that altitude increased by an estimated 20 to 50% above nominal, enough to significantly increase drag on the newly deployed satellites, which were at their most vulnerable precisely because they were at their lowest altitude and had not yet completed their orbit-raising sequence. Starlink satellites have a safe mode they enter when their onboard systems detect elevated drag. In safe mode, the satellites orient themselves edge onto the atmosphere to minimize their cross-sectional area and therefore reduce drag. This works well under normal conditions. Under the elevated thermospheric density caused by the G1 storm, safe mode was insufficient. 38 of the 49 satellites could not overcome the increased drag to raise their orbits. They re-entered Earth's atmosphere and burned up over the following days. The financial loss was in the range of $50 million. That is significant but not civilization-altering. More important is what the event demonstrated about the relationship between space weather and satellite operations. A G1 storm, the minimum level of geomagnetic disturbance, was sufficient to destroy 38 satellites in a single deployment, not damage them, not delay their orbit raising, destroy them completely. And this happened not because of a direct hardware failure, not because of radiation damage or surface charging or GPS disruption, but because of a modest increase in atmospheric drag at an altitude where the satellites happened to be at their most vulnerable. The failure pathway was not exotic. It was mundane, and it was fatal. Now, apply that lesson to the current environment. We are in a period of elevated solar activity. We have a coronal hole stream arriving simultaneously, with active regions in favourable geometry for Earth-directed eruptions. We are operating in an environment with 10 times the active satellite population of 2022, many of those satellites continuously executing avoidance maneuvers with a crash metric that has fallen from whatever it was in 2022 to 2.8 days. The February 2022 event was a warning. It demonstrated a real-world failure pathway with real-world consequences, and it happened before the orbital environment reached its current state. The question that event forces is simple and uncomfortable. If a G1 storm could destroy 38 satellites in 2022, what does a G3 or G4 storm do to an orbital environment in 2026? Part 10. The Ganon Storm. On May 10th of 2024, Earth was struck by the most powerful geomagnetic storm in approximately 2 decades. The event was designated G5, the maximum level on the NOAA scale, and it was driven by a series of coronal mass ejections that had departed the Sun over the preceding days, arriving at Earth in rapid succession and combining to produce sustained extreme geomagnetic conditions. It became known as the Ganon Storm, named after researcher Jennifer Ganon, and it generated remarkable public attention for its visual spectacle. The aurora borealis was visible from locations as far south as Mexico and the Caribbean. But the orbital operation story of the Ganon Storm received considerably less coverage, and that story is arguably more significant for understanding where we are today. During the Ganon Storm, the thermosphere expanded dramatically. At some altitudes within the low Earth orbit regime, thermospheric density increased by approximately 100%, meaning the atmosphere at those altitudes was twice as dense as nominal. The consequences for satellite operations were immediate and system-wide. The drag increase was large enough and rapid enough that hundreds of satellites simultaneously experienced orbital decay rates outside their normal operating parameters. Conjunction geometries changed suddenly across the entire population as satellites deviated from their predicted positions. The operational response was extraordinary in scale. More than half of every active satellite in low Earth orbit executed maneuvers during the Ganon Storm event and its immediate aftermath. More than half. That is not a localized response to a specific threat. That is a system-wide mobilization of essentially every spacecraft capable of maneuvering, all responding simultaneously to a rapidly changing orbital environment. Think about what that represents in terms of coordination load. Thousands of satellites all executing non-routine maneuvers within the same short window. Each maneuver changing that satellite's orbit. Each changed orbit modifying the conjunction geometry for adjacent satellites. Each modified conjunction geometry generating new warning assessments. Operators at ground stations around the world simultaneously dealing with a flood of new conjunction warnings driven by the storm-induced orbital changes, while their GPS-augmented position data was being degraded by ionospheric disruption, while their communication links were stressed by elevated radio frequency noise. The system handled it. But the Ganon Storm represents something close to the maximum operational load the current collision avoidance infrastructure has been asked to sustain. And the question that researchers and operators have been quietly asking since May of 2024 is, what happens if the next event is not of 5-day duration, but of 15-day duration? What happens if the thermospheric expansion is not 100% above nominal, but 200%? What happens if the conjunction warning flood that a G5 storm generates is large enough that the human operators in the loop, who are still required for many of the highest stakes maneuver decisions, cannot process it fast enough? The Ganon Storm stress-tested the system, and the system passed. But passing a stress test at near maximum load tells you something important. The margin between current capability and system failure is smaller than you might prefer. The system was not overwhelmed, but it was working very hard, and the environment it was working hard to manage in May of 2024 is a less densely populated, less conjunction-saturated environment than the one that exists today. The crash metric has continued to fall since the Ganon Storm. The satellite population has continued to grow. The conjunction rate has continued to increase. We are asking the same collision avoidance infrastructure, the same tracking networks, the same coordination frameworks, the same operator teams, to manage a more demanding environment than it was managing when the Ganon Storm nearly pushed it to its limits. The next major storm will hit a more saturated system, and the solar stack currently building in early May of 2026 is providing more than a routine reminder of that fact. Part 11. The 24-hour window that changes everything. Let us return to the probability curve, because it contains something that is easy to read past without fully registering its implications. The crash metric gives you the expected time to first catastrophic collision under complete loss of maneuvering. But the metric is not a clock that rings at a single moment. It describes a probability distribution, a rising curve of collision likelihood across time, and the shape of that curve matters as much as the headline number. The growth is not linear. It is not the case that losing maneuvering capability for 1 day gives you a 30% risk and losing it for 2 days gives you 60% neatly proportional. The curve is steeper than that. The probability rises slowly at first and then accelerates, because each additional hour without maneuvering capability means not just that existing close approaches go unaddressed, but that new close approaches accumulate and the conjunction list builds, and the statistical overlap between unaddressed threats increases. The risk compounds rather than adding. This means that the first 24 hours of any disruption to the collision avoidance network are the most critical, not because the risk is highest in that window, but because the decisions made in that window determine whether the system is recoverable. If a disruption begins, and the ground team can restore maneuvering capability within 24 hours, the probability of a catastrophic collision during the disruption interval was approximately 30%. Those are bad odds, but they are survivable odds. The probability that nothing went wrong is still 70%. But if the disruption extends past 24 hours, the curve begins to accelerate. And if it extends past 72 hours, past 2.8 days, the expected value has passed the point at which an actual collision becomes more likely than not. At that point, the system has almost certainly already experienced a significant event. And significant events in the current environment do not stay localized. They generate debris. Debris enters the conjunction database. The conjunction warning list grows. The demands on the collision avoidance system increase at precisely the moment when the underlying cause of the disruption is still active. There is a phrase in engineering for this kind of architecture: a system where recovery becomes progressively harder. The longer the problem persists is described as having a narrow recovery window. The window in this case is approximately 24 to 48 hours. Get the system back before that window closes and the probability is still on your side. Let it go past that window and you are managing not just the original disruption, but its compounding consequences. Time is now the most critical variable in the orbital stability equation. Not the magnitude of a disruption, not its specific cause, its duration. A severe but brief disruption is survivable. A moderate but sustained disruption may not be. And the relevant question about any incoming geomagnetic event is therefore not primarily how strong it is, but how long it lasts. Geomagnetic storms driven by coronal mass ejections typically last between 1 and 3 days at their active phase. Solar energetic particle events, which accompany some major flare activity, can last several days. High-speed streams from coronal holes persist for several days as Earth moves through them, and when multiple drivers stack, a coronal hole stream background combined with one or more coronal mass ejections from active regions in favourable geometry, the total duration of elevated geomagnetic conditions can extend well past the 24 to 48-hour recovery window into the duration range where the crash probability curve begins to accelerate. This is not a theoretical concern built on unlikely scenario stacking. This is a description of the current solar forecast. Part 12. Scenario A. Sustained solar storm. The first scenario worth tracing through is the one that the current forecast makes most concrete: a sustained geomagnetic storm in the G4 to G5 range, driven by a major coronal mass ejection from one or both of the active regions currently rotating into Earth-facing position, arriving on a background of elevated activity from the ongoing coronal hole high-speed stream. For reference points on what this looks like in historical terms, 2 events define the upper boundaries of what we know about solar storm intensity. The Carrington event of 1859 is the most powerful geomagnetic storm on record, estimated at approximately twice the strength of a modern G5. The July 2012 event, which most people have never heard of, was a near miss. A coronal mass ejection of Carrington-scale magnitude departed the Sun on July 23, 2012. It passed through the exact orbital position where Earth had been 9 days earlier. Had it occurred 9 days later, it would have struck Earth. Based on analyses of the event's characteristics, the resulting geomagnetic storm would have exceeded the Carrington event in intensity. We are not suggesting the current forecast represents a Carrington-scale event. It does not. But those events define the outer boundary of what the Sun is capable of, and they remind us that the current solar activity is not occurring in a universe where extreme events have been retired. What a G4 or G5 event does to the orbital environment, based on what we observed during the Ganon storm and extrapolated for a longer duration event, follows a fairly predictable chain. Thermospheric expansion increases drag across the entire low Earth orbit population. Satellites begin deviating from predicted orbits. The conjunction database becomes less reliable as the atmospheric model struggles to track rapid density changes. GPS augmented positioning becomes noisier as ionospheric scintillation increases. Ground station communication links become stressed by elevated radio noise. Satellite hardware begins accumulating charge-related stress from particle bombardment. Each of those effects individually is manageable. Together, under sustained conditions, they push the collision avoidance system toward the desynchronization regime we described earlier. Operators are working with imperfect data. Maneuver decisions are being made with lower confidence than normal. Some genuine close approaches are being assessed as safe, because the position uncertainty has grown large enough to swamp the signal, and the conjunction warning list is growing faster than normal because storm-induced orbital changes are generating new unexpected approach geometries. Now add duration. Not a one-day G4 storm but a 3-day one, or a 4-day one driven by multiple successive coronal mass ejections arriving in a sequence. The Ganon storm was approximately 5 days of elevated conditions. During those 5 days, more than half the active satellite population maneuvered. If the next sustained event runs to 7 or 10 days, which is not outside the range of what multiple stacking drivers can produce, you are asking the collision avoidance infrastructure to sustain near maximum operational load for a period that may approach or exceed the stamina of the human operators, the software systems, and the hardware being managed. The speculation here is clearly labelled as such. We do not know that a 7-day G5 event is coming, but the current solar configuration is the kind that, if things combine unfavourably, could produce a sustained storm of several days' duration. And a sustained storm of several days' duration in the current orbital environment is the type of event that the crash probability curve was designed to characterise. 2.8 days is not the end of the line. It is the median of a distribution that extends beyond 3 days. Part 13, Scenario B, Single Fragmentation Event. The second scenario requires stepping back from solar activity for a moment, because the trigger does not need to come from the Sun. It can come from within the orbital environment itself. In January of 2007, China conducted a direct ascent anti-satellite missile test against its own Fengyun 1C weather satellite, which was orbiting at approximately 850 kilometers altitude. The test was successful in the sense that the missile hit its target. It was catastrophic in every other sense. The collision produced an estimated 3,500 trackable debris fragments and a far larger number of untrackable ones. The debris cloud dispersed across a range of altitudes from approximately 200 kilometers to over 3,000 kilometers, with the densest concentration around the original orbit. Much of that debris is still there, because orbital decay at 850 kilometers is extremely slow. The Fengyun 1C debris field will remain a significant hazard for decades. In November of 2021, Russia conducted a similar test against its defunct Cosmos 1408 reconnaissance satellite at approximately 480 kilometers altitude. This event generated an estimated 1,500 trackable fragments at altitudes that overlap significantly with the International Space Station and the Starlink constellation operational zones. Crew members on the International Space Station were directed to shelter in their docked Soyuz capsules in case emergency evacuation became necessary. Both of those events occurred in an orbital environment that was less dense than today's. Both generated debris that is still present in the environment. Both were conducted at altitudes that are now above or within the runaway threshold zone identified in the Kessler analysis. Here is the dimension of the current situation that adds a new layer to this picture. In 2025 and continuing into 2026, there have been documented fragmentation events involving Starlink satellites. Not intentional tests, operational satellites that have fragmented, likely due to battery failures or propulsion system anomalies. The precise causes are still under investigation, and SpaceX has not provided detailed public explanations in all cases. But the relevant point is not the cause, it is the location. Starlink satellites orbit at approximately 550 kilometers. That altitude is now above the runaway threshold. When a satellite fragments at an altitude above the runaway threshold, the debris it generates enters an environment where self-sustaining collision activity is structurally possible. In the pre-threshold environment of 2010, a fragmentation event at that altitude was bad but bounded. The debris would gradually decay, and while it would be hazardous for years, it would not independently generate further collisions at a rate exceeding the decay rate. In the post-threshold environment of 2026, the same event lands in an environment where its debris can contribute to collision generation faster than atmospheric drag removes it. This is the fundamental change in what fragmentation events mean today compared to a decade ago. It is not that the events themselves are more energetic, it is that the environment they occur in has different dynamics. The debris does not just create a local hazard, it enters a system that already has the potential for self-sustaining cascade activity, and it adds fuel to a fire that, while not yet burning, has all the oxygen it needs to start, and there is currently no mechanism to remove that fuel. Part 14, Scenario C. Chain reaction from conjunction saturation. The third scenario is the one that least resembles any event we have clearly observed before, which makes it simultaneously the most speculative and the most structurally interesting. It does not require a solar storm, it does not require a fragmentation event. It emerges from the dynamics of the conjunction environment itself. The current conjunction rate is approximately one event every 22 seconds globally. Most of those events are handled routinely. A probability assessment is run, a maneuver decision is made or not made, the satellites proceed without incident. But the conjunction warning system is not perfect. Probability estimates carry significant uncertainty, especially for untracked debris. Maneuver decisions are made under time pressure with imperfect information, and each maneuver that is executed changes the orbital picture for nearby satellites, potentially generating new conjunction warnings for objects that were previously assessed as safe. In a low-density environment, this feedback is manageable. The conjunction list is short enough that errors and missed maneuvers resolve themselves without escalating. In the current high-density environment, the feedback dynamics are different. A missed maneuver for one satellite, whether due to a software error, a hardware anomaly, a communication failure, or an operator decision made under time pressure, can generate secondary conjunction warnings for 2, 3, 5 other satellites that were in the vicinity. Those satellites maneuver in response to the new warnings, changing their orbits. Their changed orbits generate tertiary warnings for adjacent satellites. The cascade of conjunction warnings and reactive maneuvers propagates outward through the constellation. This is not yet a physical collision cascade. It is a coordination cascade, a runaway increase in maneuver and warning traffic that overwhelms the operational capacity of the ground teams managing the system. But a coordination cascade and a physical cascade are not as distinct as they might appear. If the coordination cascade generates a volume of high-priority maneuver decisions that exceeds the processing capacity of human operators, some decisions will be delayed. If a delayed decision concerns a genuinely close approach, and the maneuver is executed too late or not at all, a collision occurs. If the collision occurs at altitude above the runaway threshold, it generates debris that enters the cascade-ready environment. This is the scenario that might accurately be described as a cascade without an explosion. Not a single dramatic fragmentation event, not a Carrington-scale solar storm, but a compound failure of the coordination infrastructure under the weight of its own workload, a multi-car pile-up at orbital velocity, driven not by any single catastrophic cause, but by the accumulated consequences of operating a fragile system at the edge of its management capacity. The orbital debris research community does not have a standard framework for modelling this type of failure. The tools used to model debris evolution were not designed for a world with 10,000 active satellites, all executing manoeuvres simultaneously. We are, in a real sense, in modelling territory that has not been fully mapped. Part 15. Scenario D. Intentional trigger. This part warrants a deliberate shift in tone, because it touches on territory where the evidence base is thin and the speculation potential is high. We are going to address it briefly and precisely, as the outline stipulates, and then move on. Anti-satellite weapons tests have been conducted by 4 nations: the United States, Russia, China, and India. The documented tests have generated debris at various altitudes, some of which remains in orbit today. The Fengyun 1C test of 2007 and the Cosmos 1408 test of 2021 are the most recent and most consequential. Here is the structural point that matters regardless of any discussion of intent. Both of those tests were conducted at altitudes that are now above the runaway threshold. If a similar test were conducted today, at a similar altitude, the debris it generated would land in an orbital environment with different cascade dynamics than the one that existed in 2007 or 2021. The debris would enter an environment where it can contribute to self-sustaining collision activity, not just create a bounded local hazard. There is no credible evidence of any imminent anti-satellite weapons test by any actor. This is not a suggestion that one is planned or likely. It is an observation that the structural vulnerability of the orbital environment to this class of event has increased as a consequence of threshold crossing, meaning that actions which were already irresponsible have become more consequential, regardless of the intent behind them. The point is not about any specific actor. The point is that the orbital environment has become more sensitive to large disruptions of all kinds, intentional or accidental, as a direct consequence of the density and management dependence we have spent 14 parts establishing. Whatever the trigger might be, the system is more susceptible to it than it has ever been before. Part 16. What runaway actually means. The word cascade gets used a lot in orbital debris discussions. Scientists use it, engineers use it, space policy people use it, and it is the correct word. Technically, precisely, accurately correct. But it is also a word that carries baggage, connotations built from years of disaster movies and thriller novels and news headlines that needed something dramatic to put in the first paragraph. When most people hear cascade, they picture an explosion, a chain reaction, a sudden, dramatic, visible moment of catastrophic failure, the kind of thing you could film, timestamp and point to afterward as the beginning of the end. That picture is wrong. And the gap between what the word suggests and what the thing actually is, that gap matters enormously because it shapes how seriously people take the warning. If you are waiting for the dramatic moment, you will miss the transition entirely. The transition does not look dramatic. That is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Let me tell you what a Kessler cascade actually is, because it is simultaneously more subtle and more permanent than the word alone suggests. And once you understand the mechanics, the situation we are currently in looks considerably more serious than any explosion metaphor captures. It is not an event. It is a transition. A runaway debris cascade is not an explosion. It is not an event at all, in the conventional sense of something that happens at a specific moment you could mark on a calendar. It is a transition in the dynamics of a population, a shift in the underlying mathematics governing how a system of objects behaves over time. Here is what that means in practice. Right now, in the current orbital environment, there are two competing forces acting on the debris population simultaneously. The first is atmospheric drag, the thin residual atmosphere at low Earth orbit altitudes that gradually slows objects down, causes their orbits to decay, and eventually pulls them into a fiery re-entry. The second is collision, objects hitting each other and generating new fragments, which become new debris, which represents new collision risk for everything else in the environment. Before a cascade transition, drag wins. Objects are removed from orbit faster than collisions generate new ones. The debris population, left to its own dynamics without new launches, trends downward over time. The environment is self-cleaning, slowly, imperfectly, but directionally, toward less debris. After a cascade transition, collisions win. New debris is generated faster than drag can remove it. The population trends upward. The environment is no longer self-cleaning. It is self-contaminating. And it does this on its own, without anyone launching another rocket, without any new anti-satellite test, without any additional input from human activity. The dynamics have flipped, and the population grows because the existing debris is dense enough to keep generating more. The transition between those two states, between the self-cleaning environment and the self-contaminating one, does not require a single dramatic event to trigger it. It can happen through gradual accumulation, through the slow, quiet, individually unremarkable process of collision-generated fragments crossing the point where the production rate exceeds the removal rate. There is no explosion, there is no timestamp, there is just a threshold, and then, on one side of it, a different kind of world. What irreversible actually means, here is where the language gets important, because irreversible is another word that people tend to hear in a specific way. They hear it and think, permanent, instant, done, like a glass falling off a table and shattering. Before, intact. After, gone. No recovery. That is not what irreversible means in this context. The physics are not irreversible. Atmospheric drag does not stop working after a cascade transition. Given enough time, enough centuries, enough millennia, the atmosphere will eventually remove everything from low Earth orbit. The orbit bands do not become physically sealed off from decay. The process continues. What makes it irreversible on any timescale that matters is the difference in rates. At altitudes above 500 kilometers, which is precisely where the major mega-constellations operate, where the runaway threshold has already been crossed, where the debris density is highest, the natural decay timescale for a debris object is measured in decades to centuries. A fragment produced in a collision at 550 kilometers might take 50 years to naturally re-enter. A fragment at 800 kilometers might take a century or more. The cascade, once initiated, develops on a much shorter timescale than that. The debris population fills in, collision rates increase, more fragments are produced, the density rises, and within years to decades, not centuries, the orbital bands in question become operationally unusable. Not because every object has been removed, because the density is high enough that operating a satellite in that environment becomes economically and technically impossible. The insurance rates become prohibitive. The collision probability per mission becomes unacceptable. The orbital real estate closes, not through physics sealing it off, but through the simple math of risk making it inaccessible. So when researchers say irreversible, what they mean is, the trend becomes reliable and the endpoint becomes inevitable on a timescale that matters for human civilization. Not geological time, not centuries of patient waiting for natural decay to clean things up. Decadal time, the timescale of a career, of a generation, of the infrastructure decisions being made right now by governments and companies, betting that low Earth orbit will remain accessible for the next 30 years. Why? This reframes everything. This is the part that changes how you think about every policy discussion, every launch approval, every deorbit timeline negotiation happening right now in regulatory bodies around the world. If we were talking about a system where recovery was slow but possible, where the damage was reversible, where stopping the harmful behavior would allow the environment to gradually heal, the stakes of inaction would be different. You would still want to act, but you would have the comfort of knowing that delay was costly but not fatal, that the environment could be rehabilitated, that future generations with better technology and stronger incentives could undo what current decisions left behind. The runaway cascade scenario does not offer that comfort. Once the cascade is self-sustaining, the debris population grows regardless of whether anyone ever launches another satellite. You could ground every rocket on Earth tomorrow. You could pass perfect international agreements banning all orbital activity. It would not matter. The existing debris at the existing density above the runaway threshold would continue generating new debris faster than the atmosphere removed it. The environment would continue to deteriorate on its own internal dynamics. Human inaction would not slow it. Only active removal, at a scale that does not currently exist and has no credible path to existing within the relevant timeframe, could interrupt the trend. This is what makes the current situation structurally different from most environmental problems, where cessation of harmful activity at least stops the bleeding. Here, the bleeding is potentially self-sustaining. The wound generates its own damage once the threshold is crossed. The window. There is a phrase that appears in the research literature on this topic that deserves to be repeated plainly without softening. The window for prevention is finite, not closing, not narrowing, finite. There is a specific amount of time within which intervention, active debris removal, deployment limitation, robust collision avoidance, international coordination can prevent the cascade from becoming self-sustaining. Outside that window, the interventions are no longer preventive, they are palliative, they slow the deterioration, they do not reverse it. The research this channel has been tracking suggests that window is narrower than previously believed. The models that placed the critical threshold crossing in the 2030s or 2040s were working with deployment assumptions that the mega-constellation era simply shattered. We arrived at the threshold crossing years ahead of schedule, which means the window for prevention also closed years ahead of schedule. Where exactly we are within that window right now, whether it is still open, barely, or whether we have already moved past the point where prevention is the right frame and adaptation is the more honest one, that is a question the researchers are still actively debating. The honest answer is that the uncertainty is real, and the stakes of getting it wrong in either direction are severe. But here is what is not uncertain. The cascade, if it begins, will not announce itself. It will look like elevated conjunction rates, like higher maneuver counts, like a tracking database that is slightly noisier than usual, like individual events that each have individual explanations, and then, at some point, the transition will have occurred. The debris population will be on the other side of the threshold, growing on its own dynamics, and the environment that billions of people depend on, for GPS, for weather data, for communications, for the infrastructure of modern life, will have entered a new phase. Not with an explosion, not with a timestamp, just a quiet, permanent mathematical shift in which direction the system moves. That is what cascade actually means, and that is why the word, used correctly, should be far more frightening than it sounds. Part 17. The silent collapse scenario. When most people imagine what a Kessler cascade actually looks like, the moment it becomes real, visible, undeniable, they reach for the same set of images. Hollywood has been generous with them. Satellites exploding in slow motion against the darkness of space, chunks of metal the size of refrigerators slicing through solar panels at orbital velocity. The International Space Station suddenly ringed by debris clouds, klaxons sounding, crew members scrambling into docked Soyuz capsules for emergency evacuation. A visible, dramatic, filmable catastrophe unfolding in real time above our heads. That scenario is not impossible. Elements of it have already occurred in miniature. The ISS has executed avoidance maneuvers, crews have sheltered in place, debris clouds from anti-satellite tests have forced operational responses. The drama is real. But if you are waiting for that version of events to tell you that something has gone seriously wrong in the orbital environment, you will almost certainly be waiting too long. Because the more likely early manifestation of orbital collapse does not look like any of that. It is quieter, it is slower, and in some respects it is considerably more insidious than an explosion, precisely because it does not announce itself. The scenario has a name in the research literature. Researchers call it the soft failure of orbit. And understanding it, really understanding the mechanism, not just the label, changes how you think about the timeline, the consequences, and the point at which the situation becomes unrecoverable. Here is how the soft failure actually begins. Not with a collision, not with a dramatic fragmentation event at a critical altitude. It begins with a spreadsheet. An insurance underwriter, somewhere, is looking at the actuarial data for satellite operations in a specific orbital band. The conjunction rate in that band has been rising steadily for several years. The number of tracked debris objects has increased. The probability of impact per satellite per year of operation has ticked upward. Not catastrophically, not suddenly but measurably, consistently, in a direction that only goes one way. The underwriter adjusts the premium. The satellite operator receives a renewal notice. The numbers have changed. This is the first signal of soft failure. Not a headline, not a press conference, a line item on an insurance invoice that is slightly higher than last year, for reasons that, if you trace them back far enough, connect to orbital density metrics that most people have never heard of. The operator absorbs it, passes some of the cost along, continues operating, but the margin has narrowed. Now multiply that across an industry, across hundreds of operators, thousands of satellites, multiple orbital bands, each facing incrementally higher insurance costs, each facing incrementally higher engineering requirements for collision avoidance capability. Because as conjunction rates rise, regulators demand more sophisticated avoidance systems, which means heavier satellites, more fuel, more complexity, higher launch mass, higher cost. Each facing incrementally more constrained orbital real estate as mission planners begin avoiding the most congested altitude bands, concentrating traffic into narrower corridors, which increases density in those corridors, which raises the conjunction rate further. The feedback loop is not dramatic, but it is real, and it runs in one direction. There is a specific moment, not a collision, not a cascade event, not anything that would make a news ticker, that represents the functional end of viable operations in a given orbital band. Researchers who study the economics of satellite operations call it the crossover point. It is the moment at which the operational cost of maintaining a satellite in a debris-congested environment exceeds the revenue that satellite generates. Before the crossover point, satellite operations in that band are viable, expensive perhaps, more expensive than they used to be, carrying higher risk than the previous generation of operators faced, but viable. The business case still works. The mission still makes economic sense. After the crossover point, it does not. The insurance is too expensive. The avoidance requirements eat too deeply into the mass and fuel budget. The replacement rate for satellites lost to debris impacts exceeds the deployment rate. The constellation begins to shrink, not all at once. Operators do not simultaneously abandon an orbital band on a single day. They exit gradually, mission by mission, renewal by renewal, as the economics of each individual operation tips into the red. But the aggregate effect is what matters. As operators exit, the services those satellites provided begin to degrade. Coverage gaps appear, signal quality declines, redundancy evaporates, and the users who depended on those services, who in many cases had no awareness that their daily operations were routed through a particular orbital band at a particular altitude, begin to notice that something is not working the way it used to. This is what the soft failure of orbit looks like from the ground. Not a sky full of debris, a GPS signal that is slightly less reliable, a weather forecast that is a little less accurate because one of the observation satellites in the constellation has not been replaced, a shipping container that arrives at the wrong port because the logistics system that tracked it has degraded, a farmer in a region without ground-based infrastructure who can no longer get the precision agriculture data that told them when to plant and when to shelter. None of these failures announce themselves as space failures. They arrive as service degradations, as reliability issues, as infrastructure problems with no obvious single cause and no clean solution. By the time the connection to orbital economics becomes visible enough to generate a policy response, the cascade has already been underway for years. This is where the scale of the consequences becomes important to sit with, because the infrastructure that runs on satellite services is not a luxury layer that modern civilization could reroute around if it needed to. It is load-bearing, and in many cases it is deeply non-redundant. Precision agriculture, the practice of using satellite-derived data to optimize planting schedules, irrigation, fertilizer application, and harvest timing across large-scale farming operations, now underlies a significant fraction of global food production. The efficiency gains from precision agriculture are not marginal, they are structural. Remove them, and you do not get slightly less efficient farming. You get farming that operates the way it did decades ago, at a scale that the current global population was not fed by. Global shipping logistics depends on continuous, accurate positioning data for vessels, containers, and cargo at every point in the supply chain. The just-in-time manufacturing and delivery systems that underpin modern retail, pharmaceuticals, electronics, and food distribution are calibrated to a level of positional accuracy and timing precision that ground-based systems alone cannot provide at global scale. Degrade the satellite layer and the supply chain does not smoothly adapt. It develops gaps, delays compound, inventory systems fail, shortages appear in places that had no visible warning they were coming, aviation navigation, weather forecasting, scientific Earth observation for climate monitoring, disaster response and resource management, telecommunications in the enormous fraction of the planet's surface that lacks adequate ground-based infrastructure, where satellite connectivity is not a convenience, but the only connection to global information networks that exists. All of these systems depend on continuous, reliable access to the orbital environment in ways that have only deepened over the past decade. As the satellite layer has become more capable and the ground-based alternatives have failed to keep pace, the soft failure of orbit is not, in other words, a story about the space industry. It is a story about the supply chain of global civilization encountering a failure mode it was not designed to handle, propagating from an environment most people never think about, on a timeline that could move faster than any policy response is currently structured to follow. Here is the structural problem that makes the soft failure scenario particularly difficult to address. The crossover point, the moment when orbital economics flip from viable to unviable, arrives before the physical density becomes prohibitive. The orbit bands become economically inaccessible before they become physically inaccessible, which means the window for intervention is shorter than the physical timeline suggests. If regulators and policymakers were waiting for a clear physical signal, a visible cascade event, a dramatic collision at a critical altitude, a moment of undeniable catastrophe, they would already be too late, because by the time the physical cascade is generating its own headlines, The economic cascade will have been underway for years. The operators will already be exiting. The services will already be degrading. The crossover will already have been crossed. The cost-risk calculus in an environment of accelerating debris production and rising conjunction rates can shift faster than any policy or regulatory response is designed to follow. Regulatory cycles run on years. Orbital economics can shift on months. The gap between those two timescales is where the soft failure lives, and where, if nothing changes in how seriously this problem is being governed, the consequences will quietly accumulate until they are no longer quiet. The Hollywood version of orbital collapse ends with an explosion you can see from the ground, and a crisis that generates an immediate unified global response. The real version ends with a spreadsheet, with a premium that is too high to justify renewal, with a service that degrades so gradually that nobody can identify the exact moment it stopped being reliable, with a civilization that built its infrastructure on access to the orbital environment, and then filled that environment with hazard faster than it built the tools to manage it, and discovered, too late and too quietly, that the tools it needed were not the ones it had been building. That is the soft failure of orbit, and it does not need an explosion to begin. Part 18. The ground-level consequences. There is a particular kind of moment that tends to shift a conversation from theoretical to real. It is not a graph. It is not a probability figure. It is not a research paper with a frightening number in the abstract. It is the moment when something physical lands somewhere it should not be, when the consequence stops being a projection and becomes an object you can walk up to and touch. Those moments have already happened, more than once, in more than one country, and they are worth examining in detail before we reach the larger argument this video is building toward, because they represent something important. The orbital environment's instability is no longer a future problem being modelled by researchers. It is a present condition with physical evidence already distributed across multiple continents. The story of orbital debris reaching the ground is not new. Space hardware has been falling on Earth since the earliest days of the space age. Most of it burns up harmlessly during atmospheric re-entry, consumed by the heat generated as it decelerates through the thickening air at hypersonic velocity. The engineering assumption built into most satellite and rocket design is that whatever cannot be maneuvered to a controlled re-entry over open ocean will be destroyed by re-entry heating before it reaches the surface. For smaller objects, that assumption is generally correct. For larger ones, particularly dense structural components, pressure vessels, fuel tanks, and heavy hardware built to survive the thermal and mechanical stresses of launch, it increasingly is not. In 2024, farmers in rural Poland discovered debris from a SpaceX rocket on their land. Not a fragment. Not a small piece of material that might have been mistaken for something else. A significant structural component, recognizable, substantial, the kind of hardware that immediately raised the question of what it would have meant if its re-entry trajectory had been slightly different. Slightly more populated, slightly less rural. The object had survived atmospheric re-entry intact and reached the surface with enough residual integrity to be identifiable. It sat in a field in Poland, a physical representative of an orbital environment that was supposed to clean up after itself. In 2025, debris recovered in Argentina was identified as fragments from an orbital vehicle that had not completed a clean deorbit. The fragments were distributed across a recovery area, consistent with partial breakup during re-entry, meaning the object did not survive completely intact but also did not burn up completely. It landed in pieces, in Argentina, having begun its journey several hundred kilometers above the surface of the Earth, in an environment that is managed by a regulatory framework built on the assumption that what goes up will come down cleanly, on schedule, in the right place. Australia has accumulated a more substantial record than most countries, partly because of its geography, a large landmass with significant unpopulated area that increases the probability of debris recovery relative to smaller, more densely settled nations. In recent years, multiple documented debris falls have occurred across Australian territory. The most significant, found in a paddock in New South Wales, was large enough and identifiable enough to prompt formal regulatory discussions about liability frameworks for falling space hardware. Who is responsible when a piece of orbital infrastructure lands on private property? Who pays for the damage? Who has the legal standing to make a claim, and against whom, under a 50-year-old international treaty framework that was written before commercial satellite operators existed as a category? Those questions do not yet have clean answers. The regulatory discussions they prompted are ongoing. The debris that triggered them is sitting in an evidence locker somewhere, a physical artifact of a governance gap that nobody fully closed before the problem it governs arrived. Here is where it is important to be precise, because imprecision in either direction serves no one. The risk to any specific individual from orbital debris re-entry is extremely low, lower than the risk of being struck by lightning, lower than the risk of a meteorite impact, lower than dozens of hazards that most people navigate without a second thought. If your question is whether you personally should be concerned about a piece of orbital debris landing on your head in the near future, the honest statistical answer is no. The probability is vanishingly small, but that framing, the individual risk framing, is the wrong lens for understanding what the changing debris re-entry picture actually means. The relevant question is not about individual risk. It is about the distribution of risk across populations, over time, under conditions of accelerating debris production. Consider the arithmetic. The current uncontrolled re-entry rate is rising, not because any single operator is behaving dramatically more irresponsibly than before, but because the total number of objects in orbit has grown so rapidly that even a small percentage of uncontrolled re-entries represents a larger absolute number than it did 5 years ago. As the debris population in orbit continues to grow, and particularly as the fraction of that population in higher orbits, where deorbit timescales are measured in decades rather than years, continues to increase. The statistical background rate of debris reaching the ground trends upward, not dramatically, not suddenly, but consistently, in the same direction, on the same kind of gradually steepening curve that characterizes every other metric in this story. A 2023 analysis of aviation exposure to re-entering orbital debris found that the risk per individual flight remained small, but that it was statistically distinguishable from zero across large operational populations and long-time horizons, which means that across the billions of passenger flights that occur globally over the coming decades in an environment of accelerating debris production, the probability that at least one commercial aircraft encounters re-entering orbital debris is not negligible. It is small, it is not negligible. And in an environment where debris production is accelerating, the projection becomes less comfortable with every year that passes without a meaningful reduction in the uncontrolled re-entry rate. The aviation industry is built on the systematic elimination of low-probability, high-consequence risks. It is an industry that grounds aircraft fleets over single failure events, that changes procedures in response to near misses that harmed no one. The idea that a statistically non-negligible risk of orbital debris interaction with commercial aviation would be acceptable under normal circumstances is not consistent with how that industry operates. The only reason it is currently being treated as acceptable is that the alternative, acknowledging the risk and demanding the orbital governance changes necessary to address it, would require a conversation that the relevant regulatory bodies are not yet having at the necessary scale. The debris events that have received the most sustained attention within the space operations community are not the ones that reach the ground. They are the ones that came close to occupied infrastructure in orbit. The incident involving debris proximity to the Chinese space station, fragments passing close enough to occupied orbital infrastructure to require avoidance maneuvers, did not harm anyone. The maneuvers were executed successfully. The crew was never in immediate danger in the sense that a collision was certain, but the event illustrated something that deserves to be stated plainly. The debris environment is no longer an abstract concern for future mission planners modelling scenarios that might arise decades from now. It is an active, present operational constraint for facilities that are currently occupied by human beings. The International Space Station has executed debris avoidance maneuvers. Crews have sheltered in docked vehicles as a precautionary response to conjunction warnings. These are not dramatic, headline-generating events in the way that a collision would be. They are routine operational responses to a debris environment that has become dense enough to require them. The routinization of those responses is itself a signal worth paying attention to, because things that were once exceptional enough to generate concern have become normal enough to be proceduralized. When the contingency response to a hazard becomes standard procedure, the hazard has crossed a threshold. It is no longer a scenario being planned for. It is a condition being managed. What the ground-level events, the debris in Polish fields, the fragments in Argentine recovery areas, the paddock in New South Wales, the avoidance manoeuvres around occupied space stations. Collectively represent is the leading edge of a consequence curve that runs in one direction and does not flatten on its own. The orbital environment's instability does not stay in orbit. It propagates downward through a series of connected systems, each translating the upstream problem into a downstream consequence in its own domain, into insurance markets, where re-entry liability uncertainty is beginning to show up in premium structures and coverage exclusions, into launch economics, where the cost of compliance with increasingly stringent debris mitigation requirements is built into every mission budget, into service reliability, where the degradation of satellite constellations translates into the service quality experienced by users who have no idea their connectivity, their navigation, their weather data, or their financial transaction. Infrastructure touches the orbital environment at all, and eventually at the far end of that propagation, into the availability of the satellite-derived services that underpin an enormous fraction of modern infrastructure, the services that billions of people depend on without knowing it, delivered by an orbital environment that is being asked to absorb more than it was designed to handle, managed by frameworks that were built for a world that no longer exists. The debris in that Polish field is not an isolated incident. It is a data point on a curve, and the curve is not bending toward a better outcome on its own. What happened several hundred kilometers above our heads does not stay there. It never did. We are just now building enough of a track record to prove it. Part 19. The capability gap. There is a specific kind of frustration that emerges when you spend enough time studying a well-documented problem with a clearly inadequate response. It is not the frustration of ignorance, of a situation where nobody knows what is happening or what needs to be done. It is something more uncomfortable than that. It is the frustration of a situation where the knowledge is detailed, the warnings are specific, the data is unambiguous, and the response remains, for reasons that are understandable but not acceptable, nowhere near proportionate to what the knowledge demands. That is where we are with orbital debris, and before this video reaches its closing argument, it is worth confronting that gap directly. Not to assign blame, not to perform outrage, but because understanding the scale of the response gap is essential to understanding why the current situation is as serious as the research says it is, and why the trajectory, absent a significant change in approach, does not improve on its own. Let us start with the most concrete illustration of the gap, because it is both the most advanced effort currently underway and the clearest demonstration of how far the response lags behind the problem. ClearSpace 1 is a debris removal mission funded by the European Space Agency. It represents years of engineering development, significant international collaboration between research institutions, space agencies, and commercial partners across multiple countries, a budget running into the hundreds of millions of euros, the kind of sustained, serious, resource-intensive effort that you would point to as evidence that the problem is being taken seriously. Its mission profile involves a rendezvous with a single object, Vespa, a rocket adapter stage that has been orbiting at approximately 800 kilometers since 2013, and the controlled deorbit of that object. The mission is currently scheduled for 2029. If it succeeds, it will demonstrate that active debris removal is technically feasible at scale. That is genuinely valuable. Technology demonstrations matter. The capability that ClearSpace 1 validates could, in principle, form the foundation of a removal program that scales to address the broader population, but it will remove one object. One, against a backdrop of 1.2 million trackable and untrackable objects above 1 centimeter currently in orbit. Against a debris environment that is generating new fragments through collisions and fragmentation events faster than any current or planned removal capability can address. Against a population that, under the cascade dynamics we have already described, is trending in one direction regardless of whether any new objects are launched. The arithmetic here is not cruel or unfair, it is just arithmetic. One object removed in 2029 in an environment of 1.2 million objects does not move the needle on orbital density in any statistically meaningful way on any timescale relevant to the cascade risk we are discussing. It is not nothing. But it is also not a response. It is, at best, the first proof of concept for a response that does not yet exist at the scale required. While the removal side of the equation is measured in single objects and €100 million missions targeting individual pieces of hardware, The production side is operating at a completely different scale and velocity. SpaceX continues to launch Starlink satellites at a rate that adds hundreds of new objects to the orbital environment each year. Amazon's Project Kuiper constellation has received FCC approval for more than 3,000 satellites and has moved from authorization into active deployment. China's national mega-constellation programs, multiple overlapping initiatives operating under different organizational structures but sharing the same orbital destination, have several thousand satellites authorized and are at various stages of development and launch. Other nations, other commercial operators, other constellations at various stages of planning and execution are adding to the population continuously. The production rate of new orbital objects is not slowing down, it is accelerating. The incentive structures that drove the mega-constellation boom of the early 2020s have not changed. If anything, they have intensified, as the commercial value of low Earth orbit connectivity has been demonstrated at scale, and the competitive pressure to secure orbital slots before rivals do has become a strategic imperative for both commercial operators and national space programs. The gap between the removal rate and the production rate is not a narrow one that a well-designed policy intervention could close quickly. It is a gap of multiple orders of magnitude. For every object that current removal capability can address, the production side of the ledger is adding thousands. The direction of the net balance is not ambiguous. The rules governing orbital debris mitigation were written for a world that no longer exists. This is not a criticism of the people who wrote them. The 5-year deorbit rule, requiring satellite operators to deorbit their spacecraft within 5 years of end of mission, was a reasonable, forward-thinking regulation when it was developed. It was designed for a deployment environment where a few hundred satellites were being launched per year, where the orbital population was growing slowly enough that a 5-year disposal window would keep long-term accumulation manageable. That world ended somewhere around 2019, when the mega-constellation deployment curve went vertical. The 5-year rule has not changed. The deployment environment it was designed to govern has changed beyond recognition. The consequence is a regulatory framework that is formally in place, actively enforced in many jurisdictions, and structurally inadequate for the environment it is supposed to manage, not because it is poorly enforced, but because it was designed for different physics, different scales, a different era. International coordination on debris mitigation remains largely voluntary. The Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee brings together the major spacefaring nations and agencies to develop guidelines and share data. It has produced genuinely useful technical standards, but its guidelines carry no binding legal force. Compliance is inconsistent. Enforcement mechanisms do not exist at the international level in any form that could compel a commercial operator or a national space program to modify behavior they have calculated as being in their interest. The Outer Space Treaty, which forms the foundational legal framework for international space governance, was signed in 1967. It predates the mega-constellation era by more than 50 years. It was written for a world of government space programs operating a handful of large satellites, not for a world of commercial operators deploying thousands of small ones in competitive constellations at orbital altitudes above the runaway threshold. The treaty's mechanisms for addressing the commercial orbital environment of current complexity are, to use the most generous possible framing, insufficient. Here is the gap that matters most, and the one that receives the least public attention. There is no early cascade intervention framework. There is no defined protocol, no agreed international procedure, no trigger-based action plan, no coordinated response mechanism for what happens if the crash metric crosses below 1 day. There is no established process for the international spacefaring community to follow if a major fragmentation event occurs above the runaway threshold, and the debris cloud it generates begins affecting conjunction rates across an entire orbital band. There is no action plan for a scenario in which a sustained geomagnetic storm degrades the collision avoidance network for long enough to produce a collision event in the fragility window. There is monitoring. The space surveillance network tracks what it can track. Commercial tracking services add coverage and precision. Data is shared, imperfectly and incompletely, between operators and agencies. There is communication. Conjunction warnings are issued. Maneuver recommendations are made. Ground teams coordinate as well as the current framework allows, across a landscape of competing commercial interests and strategic national rivalries. But monitoring and communication are not an action plan. They are the preconditions for an action plan, and the action plan, the specific, coordinated, internationally agreed set of responses that would be triggered if the system crossed into active cascade conditions, does not exist in any operationally meaningful form. This is not a failure of awareness. The researchers who study this problem know what is needed. The engineers who operate collision avoidance systems know what is needed. The policy analysts who have spent years studying orbital governance know what is needed. The knowledge exists. The institutional capacity to translate that knowledge into binding, coordinated, enforceable international action in a domain characterized by intense commercial competition and active strategic rivalry between the major spacefaring nations has not kept pace with the urgency of the problem. It is worth being fair about why the response gap exists, because the temptation to frame it as simple negligence or willful ignorance is both inaccurate and counterproductive. The governance of a global commons, a resource that belongs to no single nation, that is accessed by commercial operators from dozens of countries, that is strategically important to every major spacefaring power, is genuinely one of the hardest problems in international relations. The orbital environment is not like a river that can be managed by the nations it flows through. It is a shared resource with no clear owner, no natural boundaries, and no enforcement mechanism that does not require the voluntary cooperation of entities with strong incentives to prioritize their own interests over collective ones. Getting the United States, China, Russia, the European Union, and the growing roster of commercial operators to agree on binding debris mitigation standards, and then to actually comply with them in ways that can be verified in a competitive environment where compliance carries real costs, is not a problem that goodwill and technical competence alone can solve. It requires political will at a level that has not yet been demonstrated, applied to a timeline that is significantly shorter than international governance processes typically operate on. None of that makes the response gap acceptable. It makes it understandable, and understanding why a gap exists is not the same as accepting that it should continue to exist. The research is specific, the warnings are detailed, the timelines are shorter than previously believed, the production rate is accelerating. The removal capability is effectively non-existent at relevant scales. The regulatory framework was built for a world that ended 6 years ago, and the action plan for what to do if the system crosses into active cascade conditions has not been written. We are scaling faster than we can respond. That is not a forecast of what might happen if we are not careful. It is a description of what is happening right now. Part 20. The final question. Let us bring everything back together, because the picture we have built across 20 parts deserves a clear final statement. The crash clock, the metric that estimates how long the orbital environment could survive a complete loss of collision avoidance maneuvering, has fallen from 121 days in 2018 to 2.8 days as of June of 2025. That collapse happened because the orbital environment in low Earth orbit crossed the runaway threshold, the point at which cascade dynamics are structurally possible, at every altitude where mega constellations operate. The crossing happened because deployment rates between 2019 and today outpaced every model that had been developed to anticipate it, and because active debris removal capability remained effectively non-existent throughout the same period. The result is an orbital environment that is no longer inherently stable. It is a managed instability, a system that survives not because its internal dynamics are stable, but because the continuous, coordinated, uninterrupted operation of collision avoidance across thousands of satellites keeps it from expressing its inherent instability. The management layer is the stability. Remove the management and the cascade begins. And as of this week, in early May of 2026, the Sun is delivering a compound stack of geomagnetic drivers, a persistent coronal hole high-speed stream of anomalous duration, 2 active regions rotating into Earth-facing position with elevated probability of major flare activity, and forecast conditions suggesting a period of sustained geomagnetic disturbance unlike anything seen at this stage of the year. Not a Carrington event, not an extinction-level solar scenario, a sustained moderate to elevated geomagnetic stress period arriving in an orbital environment that the research says can sustain a maximum disruption of 2.8 days before the probability of catastrophic collision exceeds 50%. We have already demonstrated in the real world that a G1 storm can destroy 38 satellites in a single afternoon. We have already demonstrated during the Ganon storm of May 2024 that a G5 event forces more than half of every active satellite in low Earth orbit to maneuver simultaneously, pushing the coordination infrastructure to near maximum operational load. Both of those events happened in a less saturated, less threshold-crossed orbital environment than the one that exists today. The question at the centre of this video, what happens when ordinary solar activity meets an orbital environment that is no longer ordinary, is not answerable in advance. The solar forecast could moderate, the active regions could produce nothing more than minor flares, the coronal hole stream could weaken, the conjunction avoidance network could handle whatever arrives without significant degradation. Nothing might happen. That is a real possibility, and it is the outcome that everyone in the orbital operations community is working toward. But the possibility that nothing happens is not the same as the system being safe. A bicycle does not fall over every time the rider takes their hands off the handlebars, until it does. And when it does, the fall begins not at the moment the hands come off, but at the moment the accumulated imbalance passes the threshold where correction is no longer possible. We are riding a very fast bicycle with a very narrow recovery window in heavy traffic, with a storm building on the horizon. And we built the bicycle to be this way because it was economically convenient, and nobody had quite finished mapping the road ahead. The crash clock is at 2.8 days. The runaway threshold has already been crossed. The solar stack is already building, and the orbital environment has reached a configuration in which the difference between a close call and the beginning of an irreversible cascade could be a single storm of the wrong duration, a single fragmentation event at the wrong altitude, a single coordination failure in the wrong conjunction window. This is not a future scenario. This is the present configuration of the environment that carries your GPS signal, that guides the aircraft you fly on, that provides the weather data that tells farmers when to plant and when to shelter, that maintains the communications links on which global commerce depends. It is the environment that humanity has built into the infrastructure layer of modern civilization, and then filled with hazard faster than it built the tools to manage that hazard. The researchers who published the December 2025 preprint on the crash metric did not do so to cause panic. They did so because the data told them something that they believed people operating in and around this environment needed to know. The number had crossed into territory that warranted a different level of attention than it had previously received. They used the language of urgency because the situation had earned the language of urgency. And the solar forecast arriving this week is not a coincidence of timing, but a demonstration of something the entire analysis has been building toward. The orbital environment does not get to choose when the sun decides to be active. It does not get to request favourable conditions. It does not get to pause the conjunction rate while the management layer catches its breath. It is exposed continuously to an external environment that it has no control over, and its ability to survive that exposure depends entirely on the management layer functioning correctly without interruption for as long as the exposure lasts. The system is not broken, not yet. The satellites are still maneuvering, the tracking networks are still operating, the conjunction warnings are still being processed. The orbital environment is still, in the technical sense of the word, stable. But stable and safe are no longer the same thing. Stable now means actively managed, continuously coordinated, perpetually responsive. Stable means the bicycle is still upright because the rider has not let go. What keeps scientists nervous is not that they believe a cascade is inevitable. What keeps them nervous is something more specific and more difficult to dismiss. It is the knowledge that the system has moved into a regime where cascade is possible, that the margin separating the current managed state from an unmanaged cascade has shrunk from months to days, and that the triggers capable of initiating that transition are not exotic. They are ordinary. They are the kind of things that happen, that have happened, that are forecast to happen in the next 10 days. The cascade, if it begins, will not announce itself. There will be no single moment at which someone looks at a screen and says, "There it is, that is the beginning." It will look at first like an elevated conjunction rate, like a higher than normal maneuver count, like a tracking database that is a little noisier than usual, like a ground station dealing with a communication outage, like a satellite that missed a maneuver it should have executed, like a fragmentation event that generates a debris cloud in an altitude band that is already saturated. And then, at some point, the thing that the researchers have been saying is structurally possible will become structurally actual, and the environment that billions of people depend on, without knowing it, for the infrastructure of their daily lives will have entered a new phase, one that no active removal mission, no regulatory framework, no international agreement, and no technical innovation can reverse on any timescale that matters for the civilization operating beneath it. We won't know we've crossed the line until we're already on the other side. The crash clock is still running,